Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We are continuing reading from The Adventures of Pinocchio, and today we're starting with Chapter 20. Liberated from prison, he starts to return to the fairy's house, but on the road he meets with a horrible serpent, and afterwards he is caught in a trap. You can imagine Pinocchio's joy when he found himself free. Without stopping to take breath, he immediately left the town and took the road that led to the fairy's house. On account of the rainy weather, the road had become a marsh into which he sank knee-deep. But the puppet would not give in. Tormented by the desire of seeing his father and his little sister with blue hair again, he ran and leapt like a greyhound, and as he ran, he was splashed with mud from head to foot. And he said to himself as he went along, "How many misfortunes have happened to me, and I deserve them, for I am an obstinate, passionate puppet. I am always bent upon having my own way without listening to those who wish me well, and who have 1,000 times more sense than I have. But from this time forth I am determined to change and to become orderly and obedient, for at last I have seen that disobedient boys come to no good and gain nothing. And will my papa have waited for me? Shall I find him at the fairy's house? Poor man! It is so long since I last saw him. I am dying to embrace him and to cover him with kisses. And will the fairy forgive me my bad conduct to her? To think of all the kindness and loving care I received from her. To think that if I am now alive, I owe it to her. Would it be possible to find a more ungrateful boy, or one with less heart than I have?" Whilst he was saying this, he stopped suddenly, frightened to death, and made 4 steps backwards. What had he seen? He had seen an immense serpent stretched across the road. Its skin was green, it had red eyes, and a pointed tail that was smoking like a chimney. It would be impossible to imagine the puppet's terror. He walked away to a safe distance, and sitting down on a heap of stones, waited until the serpent should have gone about its business and had left the road clear. He waited an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, but the serpent was always there, and even from a distance he could see the red light of his fiery eyes and the column of smoke that ascended from the end of his tail. At last Pinocchio, trying to feel courageous, approached to within a few steps, and said to the serpent in a little soft, insinuating voice, "Excuse me, Sir Serpent, but would you be so good as to move a little to one side, just enough to allow me to pass?" He might as well have spoken to the wall. Nobody moved. He began again in the same soft voice. "You must know, Sir Serpent, that I am on my way home, where my father is waiting for me, and it is such a long time since I saw him last. Will you therefore allow me to continue my road?" He waited for a sign in answer to this request, but there was none. In fact, the serpent, who up to that moment had been sprightly and full of life, became motionless and almost rigid. He shut his eyes, and his tail ceased smoking. "Can he really be dead?" said Pinocchio, rubbing his hands with delight. And he determined to jump over him and reach the other side of the road. But just as he was going to leap, the serpent raised himself suddenly on end, like a spring set in motion, and the puppet, drawing back in his terror, caught his feet and fell to the ground. And he fell so awkwardly that his head stuck in the mud and his legs went into the air. At the sight of the puppet kicking violently with his head in the mud, the serpent went into convulsions of laughter, and he laughed and laughed and laughed until from the violence of his laughter he broke a blood vessel in his chest and died. And that time he really was dead. Pinocchio then set off running in hopes that he should reach the fairy's house before dark. But before long he began to suffer so dreadfully from hunger that he could not bear it, and he jumped into a field by the wayside, intending to pick some bunches of muscatel grapes. Oh, that he had never done it! He had scarcely reached the vines when crack! His legs were caught between 2 cutting iron bars, and he became so giddy with pain that stars of every color danced before his eyes. The poor puppet had been taken in a trap put there to capture some big polecats who were the scourge of the poultry yards in the neighborhood. Chapter 21. Pinocchio is taken by a peasant who obliges him to fill the place of his watchdog in the poultry yard. Pinocchio, as you can imagine, began to cry and scream, but his tears and groans were useless, for there was not a house to be seen, and not a living soul passed down the road. At last night came on, partly from the pain of the trap that cut his legs, and a little from fear at finding himself alone in the dark in the midst of the fields. The puppet was on the point of fainting. Just at that moment he saw a firefly flitting over his head. He called to it and said, "Oh, little firefly, will you have pity on me and liberate me from this torture?" "Poor boy," said the firefly, stopping and looking at him with compassion, "but how could your legs have been caught by those sharp irons?" "I came into the field to pick 2 bunches of these muscatel grapes, and—" "But were the grapes yours?" "No." Then who taught you to carry off other people's property? I was so hungry. Hunger, my boy, is not a good reason for appropriating what does not belong to us. That is true, said Pinocchio, crying. I will never do it again. At this moment, the conversation was interrupted by a slight sound of approaching footsteps. It was the owner of the field, coming on tiptoe to see if one of the polecats that ate his chickens during the night had been caught in his trap. His astonishment was great when, having brought out his lantern from under his coat, he perceived that instead of a polecat, the boy had been taken. Ah, little thief, said the angry peasant, then it is you who carries off my chickens. No, it is not I. Indeed, it is not, cried Pinocchio, sobbing. I only came into the field to take 2 bunches of grapes. He who steals grapes is quite capable of stealing chickens. Leave it to me. I will give you a lesson that you will not forget in a hurry. Opening the trap, he seized the puppet by the collar and carried him to his house as if he had been a young lamb. When he reached the yard in front of the house, he threw him roughly on the ground, and putting his foot on his neck, he said to him, It is late, and I want to go to bed. We will settle our accounts tomorrow. In the meanwhile, as the dog who kept guard at night died today, you shall take his place at once. You shall be my watchdog. And taking a great collar covered with brass knobs, he strapped it tightly around his throat that he might not be able to draw his head out of it. A heavy chain attached to the collar was fastened to the wall. If it should rain tonight, he then said to him, you can go and lie down in the kennel. The straw that has served as a bed for my poor dog for the last 4 years is still there. If, unfortunately, robbers should come, remember to keep your ears pricked and to bark. After giving him this last injunction, the man went into the house, shut the door, and put up the chain. Poor Pinocchio remained lying on the ground more dead than alive from the effects of cold, hunger, and fear. From time to time, he put his hands angrily to the collar that tightened his throat and said, crying, It serves me right. Decidedly, it serves me right. I was determined to be a vagabond and a good-for-nothing. I would listen to bad companions, and that is why I always meet with misfortunes. If I had been a good little boy, as so many are, if I had been willing to learn and to work, if I had remained at home with my poor papa, I should not now be in the midst of the fields and obliged to be the watchdog to a peasant's house. Oh, if I could be born again! But now it is too late, and I must have patience. Relieved by this little outburst, which came straight from his heart, he went into the dog kennel and fell asleep. Chapter 22. Pinocchio discovers the robbers, and as a reward for his fidelity, is set at liberty. He had been sleeping heavily for about 2 hours when toward midnight he was roused by a whispering of strange voices that seemed to come from the courtyard. Putting the point of his nose out of the kennel, he saw 4 little beasts with dark fur that looked like cats, standing consulting together. But they were not cats. They were polecats, carnivorous little animals, especially greedy for eggs and young chickens. One of the polecats, leaving his companions, came to the opening of the kennel and said in a low voice, Good evening, Melampo. My name is not Melampo, answered the puppet. Oh, then who are you? Sorry. I am Pinocchio. And what are you doing here? I am acting as watchdog. Then where is Melampo? Where is the old dog who lived in this kennel? He died this morning. Is he dead? Poor beast, he was so good, but judging you by your face, I should say you were also a good dog. I beg your pardon, I am not a dog. Not a dog? Then what are you? I am a puppet. And you are acting as a watchdog? That is only too true, as a punishment. Well, then, I will offer you the same conditions that we made with the deceased Melampo, and I am sure you will be satisfied with them. What are these conditions? 1 night in every week you are to permit us to visit this poultry yard, as we have hitherto done, and to carry off 8 chickens. Of these chickens, 7 are to be eaten by us, and 1 we will give to you, on the express understanding, however, that you pretend to be asleep, and that it never enters your head to bark and to wake the peasant. Did Melampo act in this manner? Asked Pinocchio. Certainly, and we were always on the best terms with him. Sleep quietly, and rest assured that before we go, we will leave by the kennel a beautiful chicken ready plucked for your breakfast tomorrow. Have we understood each other clearly? Only too clearly, answered Pinocchio, and he shook his head threateningly, as much as to say, You shall hear of this shortly. The 4 polecats, thinking themselves safe, repaired to the poultry yard, which was close to the kennel, and having opened the wooden gate with their teeth and claws, they slipped in one by one. But they had only just passed through when they heard the gate shut behind them with great violence. It was Pinocchio who had shut it, and for greater security he put a large stone against it to keep it closed. He then began to bark, and he barked exactly like a watchdog. Bow wow, bow wow. Hearing the barking, the peasant jumped out of bed, and taking his gun to the window, he came to the window and asked, "What is the matter?" "There are robbers," answered Pinocchio. "Where are they?" "In the poultry yard." "I will come down directly." In fact, in less time than it takes to say amen, the peasant came down. He rushed into the poultry yard, caught the polecats, and having put them into a sack, he said to them in a tone of great satisfaction, "At last you have fallen into my hands. I might punish you, but I am not so cruel. I will content myself instead by carrying you in the morning to the innkeeper of the neighboring village, who will skin and cook you as hares with the sweet and sour sauce. It is an honor that you don't deserve, but generous people like me don't consider such trifles." He then approached Pinocchio and began to caress him, and amongst other things he asked of him, "How did you manage to discover the 4 thieves? To think that Melampo, my faithful Melampo, never found out anything." The puppet might have then told him the whole story. He might have informed him of the disgraceful conditions that had been made between the dog and the polecats, but he remembered that the dog was dead, and he thought to himself, What is the good of accusing the dead? The dead are dead, and the best thing to be done is to leave them in peace. When the thieves got into the yard, were you asleep or awake? The peasant went on to ask him. "I was asleep," answered Pinocchio, "but the polecats woke me with their chatter, and one of them came to the kennel and said to me, 'If you promise not to bark and not to wake the master, we will make you a present of a fine chicken already plucked.' To think that they should have the audacity to make such a proposal to me, for although I am a puppet, possessing perhaps nearly all of the faults in the world, there is one that I certainly will never be guilty of, that of making terms with, and sharing in the gains of, dishonest people." "Well said, my boy," cried the peasant, slapping him on the shoulder. "Such sentiments do you honor, and as a proof of my gratitude, I will at once set you at liberty, and you may return home." And he removed the dog's collar. Chapter 23. Pinocchio mourns the death of the beautiful child with the blue hair. A pigeon flies with him to the seashore, and there he throws himself into the water to go to the assistance of his father Geppetto. As soon as Pinocchio was released from the heavy and humiliating weight of the dog collar, he started off across the fields and never stopped until he had reached the high road that led to the fairy's house. There he turned and looked down into the plain beneath. He could see distinctly with his naked eye the wood where he had been so fortunate as to meet with the fox and the cat. He could see amongst the trees the top of the big oak to which he had been hung. But although he looked in every direction, the little house belonging to the beautiful child with the blue hair was nowhere visible. Seized with a sad presentiment, he began to run with all the strength he had left, and in a few minutes he reached the field where the little white house had once stood. But the little white house was no longer there. He saw instead a marble stone on which were engraved these sad words, "Here lies the child with the blue hair, who died from sorrow because she was abandoned by her little brother Pinocchio." I leave you to imagine the puppet's feelings when he had with difficulty spelt out this epitaph. He fell with his face on the ground and, covering the tombstone with 1,000 kisses, burst into an agony of tears. He cried all night, and when morning came he was still crying, although he had no tears left, and his sobs and lamentations were so acute and heartbreaking that they roused the echoes in the surrounding hills. And as he wept, he said, "Oh, little fairy, why did you die? Why did I not die instead of you? I, who am so wicked, whilst you were so good. And my papa, where can he be? Oh, little fairy, tell me where I can find him, for I want to remain with him always, and never to leave him again, never again. Oh, little fairy, tell me that it is not true that you are dead. If you really love me, if you really love your little brother, come to life again. Come to life as you were before. Does it not grieve you to see me alone and abandoned by everybody? If assassins come, they will hang me again to the branch of a tree, and then I should die indeed. What do you imagine that I can do here alone in the world? Now that I have lost you and my papa, who will give me food? Where shall I go to sleep at night? Who will make me a new jacket? Oh, it would be better, 100 times better, that I should die also. Yes, I want to die. I. And in his despair he tried to tear his hair. But his hair, being made of wood, he could not even have the satisfaction of sticking his fingers into it. Just then a large pigeon flew over his head and, stopping with distended wings, called down to him from a great height. "Tell me, child, what are you doing there?" "Don't you see? I am crying," said Pinocchio, raising his head toward the voice and rubbing his eyes with his jacket. "Tell me, continued the pigeon. Amongst your companions, do you happen to know a puppet who is called Pinocchio? Pinocchio? Did you say Pinocchio? Repeated the puppet, jumping quickly to his feet. I am Pinocchio. The pigeon, at this answer, descended rapidly to the ground. He was larger than a turkey. Do you also know Geppetto? He asked. If I know him, he is my poor papa. Has he perhaps spoken to you of me? Will you take me to him? Is he still alive? Answer me, for pity's sake, is he still alive? I left him 3 days ago on the seashore. What was he doing? He was building a little boat for himself to cross the ocean. For more than 3 months, that poor man has been going all around the world looking for you. Not having succeeded in finding you, he has now taken it into his head to go to the distant countries of the New World in search of you. How far is it from here to the shore? Asked Pinocchio breathlessly. More than 600 miles. 600 miles? Oh, beautiful pigeon, what a fine thing it would be to have your wings. If you wish to go, I will carry you there. How? Astride on my back. Do you weigh much? I weigh next to nothing. I am as light as a feather. And without waiting for more, Pinocchio jumped at once on the pigeon's back, and putting a leg on each side of him as men do on horseback, he exclaimed joyfully, Gallop, gallop, my little horse, for I am anxious to arrive quickly. The pigeon took flight, and in a few moments it soared so high that they almost touched the clouds. Finding himself at such an immense height, the puppet had the curiosity to turn and look down, but his head spun around, and he became so frightened that to save himself from the danger of falling, he wound his arms tightly round the neck of his feathered steed. They flew all day. Towards evening, the pigeon said, I am very thirsty. And I am very hungry, rejoined Pinocchio. Let us stop at that dovecote for a few minutes, and then we will continue our journey, that we may reach the seashore by dawn tomorrow. They went into a deserted dovecote where they found nothing but a basin full of water and a basket full of vetch. The puppet had never in his life been able to eat vetch. According to him, it made him sick and revolted him. That evening, however, he ate to repletion, and when he had nearly emptied the basket, he turned to the pigeon and said to him, I never could have believed the vetch was so good. Be assured, my boy, replied the pigeon, that when hunger is real and there is nothing else to eat, even vetch becomes delicious. Hunger knows neither caprice nor greediness. Having quickly finished their little meal, they recommenced their journey and flew away. The following morning they reached the seashore. The pigeon placed Pinocchio on the ground, and not wishing to be troubled with thanks for having done a good action, he flew away quickly and disappeared. The shore was crowded with people who were looking out to sea, shouting and gesticulating. What has happened? Asked Pinocchio of an old woman. A poor father who has lost his son has gone away in a boat to search for him on the other side of the water. And today the sea is tempestuous, and the little boat is in danger of sinking. Where is the little boat? It is out there in a line with my finger, said the old woman, pointing to a little boat which, seen at that distance, looked like a nutshell with a very little man in it. Pinocchio fixed his eyes on it, and after looking attentively, he gave a piercing scream, crying, It is my papa! It is my papa! The boat, meanwhile, beaten by the fury of the waves, at one moment disappeared in the trough of the sea, and the next came again to the surface. Pinocchio, standing on the top of a high rock, kept calling to his father by name and making every kind of signal to him with his hands, his handkerchief, and his cap. And although he was so far off, Geppetto appeared to recognize his son, for he also took off his cap and waved it, and tried by gestures to make him understand that he would have returned if it had been possible, but that the sea was so tempestuous that he could not use his oars or approach the shore. Suddenly, a tremendous wave rose, and the boat disappeared. They waited, hoping it would come again to the surface, but it was seen no more. Poor man, said the fishermen, who were assembled on the shore, and murmuring a prayer, they turned to go home. Just then they heard a desperate cry, and looking back, they saw a little boy who exclaimed as he jumped from a rock into the sea, I will save my papa. Pinocchio, being made of wood, floated easily, and he swam like a fish. At one moment they saw him disappear under the water, carried down by the fury of the waves, and next he reappeared struggling with a leg or an arm. At last they lost sight of him, and he was seen no more. Poor boy, said the fishermen who were collected on the shore, and murmuring a prayer, they returned home. We'll stop there and start next time with Chapter 24. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.